Creating an entire world with kingdoms, empires, separate races, its own magic system or technology can really burn you out. I absolutely understand that. Building something brick by brick and not seeing the end of it can be very overwhelming. Some writers avoid world building at all, and some use it as a procrastination tool, better known as action faking. But there is a great way to start. A way where you can balance world building with actually writing a story in a fleshed out world. So when it comes to starting with world building, the best way to create something worthwhile, but in the same time not to be crushed under the weight of creating an entire world, is to start small. To start with what I call a localized world building. I already made a video how to start world building a long time ago, and that video is more of an intro on how to even approach it. So if you know nothing about world building and you just want to start from scratch, you never did that before, I would recommend to start with that video first and then come back here later. Because this one is more of a step-by-step guide on what to avoid and what to do when creating a small localized world building. So what I mean by start small, because by definition world building is building a world, which cannot really be small, right? Well, not exactly. In terms of fiction, the quote-unquote world is very contextual. The world is wherever the story is taking place, and if the story takes place in one specific location, then for the purpose of storytelling, this place is the quote-unquote entire world of the story. So, for example, you might say that the Elder Scrolls 3 Morrowind takes place in Tamriel, which is true, but you're actually bound to only one specific region, which is the island of Vardenfell. We know that Vardenfell is part of the Empire of Tamriel, and there are things happening outside of this place that influence Vardenfell, but the story is localized in this very specific area. And it doesn't need to be a piece of land. If we take, for example, the movie Alien, the vast majority of the story takes place in the spaceship Nostromo. We don't actually know much about the broader universe, what is the dominant government on Earth, or anything like this. So the movie focuses on the world building inside of Nostromo, how the ship works, what is its purpose, etc. Localized world building is what actually most stories do. They start small from one specific place and then build up. This have pros and cons, but it is a great way to learn world building that way. So what you do first is set a story in a specific place. Remember that the size of this place is very important. The bigger the place you create, the more work you will need to do. If you are writing a linear story, so for example for a book or a movie, then you only need a logical explanation why the story takes place here. However, if you're writing a story in an interactive medium, like a video game or an RPG campaign, then you need to find a logical justification why the player cannot leave this area. A great example of this is the video game Gothic. In Gothic, the story takes place in a mining valley that is surrounded by a magical barrier that kills anyone that wants to escape. This magical barrier is not some BS way why you cannot leave. This is a big part of the story. The main plot is about escaping this place and destroying the barrier. So the story of the game uses a part of its world building as a big plot point. But a magical barrier is just one of many examples. You can make a story about a group of explorers that, let's say, crash landed on an alien and dangerous island, and this is the justification why the story is bound to that specific place. They don't know where they are, their transport is completely wrecked, and the characters need to figure out how to leave this place, and to do that, they need to explore it. And it is easy to create a specific isolated place in fantasy, because you can just use the geography. You can create a impassable mountain range, or make it an island in the middle of a storming sea, or anything like this. But you can do similar things for science fiction as well, although it is a bit harder. You can make a story to take place in an isolated space station, for example. This will limit the quote-unquote broader world, and you might explain the reason why nobody can leave it, but at least you don't need to constantly think about all the space politics and thousands of planets and how they correlate with each other. A great example of a writing tool for space isolation is in Warhammer 40k. In 40k there is a cosmic phenomenon called a warp storm. It is a giant storm of interdimensional menace that can just appear anywhere out of nowhere, and it can last from a couple of days up to hundreds or even thousands of years. It cuts all communication and makes traveling almost impossible. You want a story to take place just in one planet and want it isolated? Bam, warp storm. The reason why we want to start in a smallish place is because this allows you to make world building in a much smaller scale. If you're not experienced enough in world building, making an entire planet worth of fiction can very easily overwhelm you. When brainstorming world building, you need to start from very general concepts. Just imagine what you want here to be. Let's say a settlement of elves who live in isolation, a fortress of renegade troops from a kingdom far, far away from here, or maybe there is a huge mountain where a giant red dragon slumbers. Create some general ideas, put them there and try to figure out how they can coexist together, so they will make more logical sense within your world. If you really want to flesh them out and make them more real, add some backstory for them. Why these people are here in the first place? Who was here first and who came afterwards? How do they coexist? Do they even know about each other? Next, you need to create an internal ecosystem. I am of course not only talking about flora or fauna, but also about the reason why life exists here at all. Where are the people here taking the resources from? What is the source of food? What is the primary building material? If there is no iron here, for example, and this place is isolated from trade, then maybe don't give local people weapons and tools made of iron because it wouldn't make sense. And to spice things up at the end, you create factions. Even if this small place that you created is inhabited by just one nation, one kingdom, just one unified people, you can still create factions within this nation. For example, commercial factions, political factions, military factions, then sub-factions within those factions. If you want to know more specifically about world building factions, then I have a video about that as well, so you can check it out if you want to focus on that specific thing in your world building and you want them more fleshed out instead of a pile of exaggerated stereotypical traits. Now when you have a general idea for this place, you need to make it feel bigger, much bigger than it actually is. Do you know how there are video games that tell you that we have the biggest map ever, the biggest world ever created in a video game? And then you go and play that video game and yeah, they're correct, the map is big, but it's just a vast pile of nothing. And then you have small games that are happening in a much smaller scale, within just one city or within one specific localized place. And those games feel much bigger than they actually are. They feel alive. Every character there and every NPC there, every single person who lives in that world feel like they actually belong to that world and they are a necessary part of it. This is what we will be aiming at. The first and most important thing that will immediately make your world feel bigger is to fill it with depth. Breathe some life into it. What I mean by that? I mean that if you have a forest, for example, a forest by itself is boring. It's just trees and animals and nothing else. A forest is also a very stereotypical place in fantasy settings. So you make it more interesting and fleshed out. Make places in this forest with history. Maybe there are ruins of some buildings scattered around that are consumed by plants and trees. And maybe in this specific place there is far more foliage than normal. Make some lore about the purpose of those ruins. Why are they more overgrown with greenery than they are supposed to be? That is of course just one idea, but you can add things up to it and connect them together. You can for example add a tribe of cannibal mutated humanoids that are maybe related to those ruins. You make that place a bit more unique, you flesh it out with lore and additional pieces of world building. Yet another way to make your world feel bigger than it actually is to connect it with the outside world. What I mean by that is to make some kind of lore connection to the broader universe. Is there a shortage of iron and coal? Maybe it is because there is a big war happening on the continent far away from here, and because of that the trade is disrupted. Whenever something is happening, you can allude to a bigger event that is happening abroad. You can even close this area by saying that currently in the broader world there is a deadly plague spreading and this place is quarantined from the rest of the world. The entire central plot with all the connecting factions maybe related to a diplomat from another kingdom who's here to make a deal. And you don't need to do it all big and political. Those might be small things, like exotic goods in the market that allude to a different place, a merchant from a faraway land with a different accent, a sudden drought in one specific place of your small location that was caused by the fact that someone redirected a key river that was flowing through this land, or maybe a mercenary company who was a key faction in this region suddenly left because they were hired by some outside party, which will be a hint that there is a war brewing somewhere, and that will also create a power vacuum in this area. By building a lot of connections to the outside world, the world that is not really built yet, you create breadcrumbs for something bigger. You create the illusion of this world being much bigger and alive. There are things happening outside of this place, and that influence the stability and the well-being of people who live here. And one of the last big things that will really help to flesh out your world is political dynamics. Now, before you get scared by the word political, that sentence does not mean that you need to have a giant political intrigue like in Game of Thrones, for example. Something happening like the aforementioned drought or an eruption of a volcano can disrupt the delicate balance of power in the region. Maybe a tribe of primitive orcs will see that volcanic eruption as a sign from gods and will suddenly start attacking and raiding the area. Maybe the drought that happened due to the redirection of a river causes a massive shortage of food, and that makes local farmers more desperate. Maybe this event is the last straw which caused them to finally rebel against the city and unite against it. You can even do both, and no matter what you choose to do, this will completely change the dynamic of the region. If you want to tell a story in such a setting, those things can give you great narrative tools to up the stakes. Now, a region that was peaceful and tranquil will be in chaos. Rebelling peasants who see anyone as a threat and raiding bands of orcs will make traveling much more difficult. When you create a localized setting, you can really focus on those things because you don't need to overthink constantly about the broader world. Work organization is one of those things that barely anyone talks about when it comes to writing and storytelling and world building. And yeah, sure, we do have some amazing tools like World Anvil, but those tools are kind of useless if you don't know what to do with them and how to do it and why you should do it in the first place. So the most important thing that you should have is a central design document. Now, don't be scared with that name. It sounds very bureaucratic, but don't worry, I won't be here making a college-styled lecture about definitions and such. A central design document is just a place where you put all your information into. It can be anything. You can just have a normal notebook or a series of Word documents categorized in folders. It's very important to have this because this will avoid the biggest mistake that any writer can do with their story: inconsistency. Because let's think for a moment. Why do we love stories? Why do we care so much about what is happening in them? Why do we care about the characters that are in them? Because they feel real. They feel like real human beings, even though we know deep down that they are just fictional characters. To maintain this level of care, we need to suspend our disbelief. We need to, at least for a moment, forget that this is just all fiction. And if things are inconsistent, if the story doesn't make any sense and keep contradicting itself, the suspension of disbelief will shatter. No matter how amazing story you have, if the suspension of disbelief is shattered, they will no longer feel engaged with it. And we don't want that. We create stories for others to enjoy and appreciate. So, organize, write down everything, categorize them, make folders for factions, for races, for your magic system, for politics and ongoing events. If you create something that relates to the broader world and you didn't focus on the broader world, make a note so that later, if you would want to expand your world, you will have this information available on hand and you will not break the internal consistency of your world building. Even if you finished your world building of this local area and you started writing your story now, but you decided to allude to something bigger happening far away in your story, make a note, write it down. After you finish writing, you will have this information available for the future. When you will have things written down, it will also be much easier for you to connect plots with each other. And the last, very important thing, avoid retcons. Retcons are a lazy way to change something retroactively. It happens whenever a writer just writes itself into a corner or they just don't like what they set up. Be careful when you create plots and mention something that is happening outside, or when you create a backstory. Be sure to read them again and again so that you are absolutely convinced that this is something you actually want to create, so that later on you will not need to retcon it. Because you will regret writing them in retrospect, and changing it would mean retconning. And that is a big blow to your internal consistency. If you are not sure about something, then use the unreliable character. You may have heard about the unreliable narrator, which is usually a very cheap trick for lazy writers to change something in their story that is very inconvenient for them. A much better way to do it is the unreliable character. You present a character that says something about the broader world building, but you create it in such a way that it does not need to be true. Let's say there is an old sailor who tells you something about this small kingdom far, far away from here, but he constantly drinks, and the last time he was there was like 2 decades ago. The information that he has might be warped by time and alcohol, and a lot of things might have changed in those 2 decades. You can also write him to be a very superstitious person and have a bias towards something. If that character will say something, now you as a writer will have a in-universe logical excuse why this information might not be true. What you do is you basically create yourself a backdoor that if you provided some information within the plot, because you provided it through that specific unreliable character, the part of your audience that is very attentive to your story will now see that character and they will understand why this information was not true, and it makes sense. It's not shattering their suspension of disbelief. Localized world building has its own problems, however, because building your world brick by brick might feel better because you do it, gradually, and you don't wait for everything to be built to write your story in. But because you started to build it brick by brick, story by story, it makes you very quickly forget about something that you already established, or you'd retcon something very quickly because you just forget that you did something. Also, your world might not really feel that fleshed out if you start very small and then just add stuff into it without exploring everything else. And you can see that problem in the popular media, and it's not just a modern problem, that was a problem for a very long time. Any single story that you can find that ran for long enough and was not pre-planned to run for such a long period of time, sooner or later they reach a point where nothing makes any sense, things keep contradicting itself. However, if you want to continue writing locally, I would highly suggest to focus on factions, because if you write locally, then you don't have huge kingdoms and empires to write big epic stories. You need something much smaller, and factions are a great example how to do that. Luckily for you, I have already a video about world building factions you can check right now, and I hope that you took a lot of value from that video. My name is Lord T, and if you are interested in writing on world building, then my channel is for you. But you need to remember that you are always just one page, one chapter away from writing a great story. With that, I bid you farewell.